There is a kind of ache that follows a man into the mountains, the kind that settles deep and refuses to let go. 5 winters ago, Eli Boone left the world behind, carries only his silence and a husky who never questioned it. But on a fog-heavy morning when ash led him to a cave no map had ever named, Eli realized the past he'd buried wasn't done with him yet. Been waiting for him. Autumn came early to the high country that year, sliding down off the crowns of the northern Montana peaks like a slow, patient tide of cold. Mornings on the Granite Woods Ridge started in shades of blue and silver, frost etching the old fence posts and the black spruce trunks, mist lifting off the creek in thin white ribbons that caught the first light. Out beyond the last gravel road, where the maps thinned and the cell signal gave up, the mountains took over entirely. Steep shoulders of rock and pine running north toward the Canadian line, gullies filled with shadow and snow even in September, ravens making slow circles over dead snags. It was a big, empty country, the kind that made a man feel small and, if he stayed long enough, honest. That was precisely why Elliard Boone had chosen it. Eli, because nobody out here used the longer name unless they were reading off some government form, had spent the last 5 winters in a cabin he'd built with his own hands on the western flank of Cold Creek Ridge. From a distance, he looked like every old story people told about mountain men, tall and knotted with the kind of muscle you don't get from a gym, shoulders broad from years of swinging tools and carrying packs, beard gone more salt than pepper now, and lines carved permanent at the corners of his eyes from squinting into smoke and sunlight. Under the leather hat that had seen better days, his hair had gone to a rough, dark gray that matched the weathered boards of the cabin behind him. He moved the way men move who have learned the cost of wasting energy. Deliberate, efficient, never in a hurry, but never truly at rest either. He wore the same kind of clothes most days, a heavy brown leather jacket scuffed from years of brush and rock, a flannel shirt gone soft with washing, faded denim, and old but well-oiled boots that remembered 100 trails. If you looked close, if you ever got near enough, you might notice the faint scars that climbed from his left wrist to his forearm, pale lines like old lightning, and the deeper one at his temple where a falling branch had once split skin and bone. To the folks in the nearest town of Wildford, 20 winding miles and 1 snow-prone pass away, Eli Boone was part mystery and part rumor, the man in his late 40s who came down off the ridge twice a season for flour, coffee, gas, dog food, and nails, speaking politely but not past what was necessary, always paying in cash, never staying long enough for anyone to ask real questions. They watched his truck roll slowly past the diner and the feed store, and they lowered their voices, saying things like, "He's the one who used to jump fires, you know," or, "He's the fella who lost too much, too fast," with that mix of pity and respect small towns reserve for people who have suffered in ways they hope never to understand. They were right about some of it. Eli had been a smoke jumper once, one of the men who stepped out of airplanes into the red glow of burning timber, trusting a silk canopy and a practiced roll to put him where he could cut lines and save homes he'd never sleep in. The work had given him a purpose and taken more than its share in return. There had been bad seasons and worse days, patches of memory he still woke up from with his heart hammering and his hands clenched in the blankets, the smell of pitch and ash still clinging to his clothes even though the last fire he'd jumped was years behind him. Somewhere in that blur he'd lost people. Exactly who and how was something he didn't lay out in words even inside his own head. It was enough to know that one day the world had felt full, and then, without much warning, it hadn't. After that, the city noise had become unbearable, the sirens and traffic and polite condolences from people who didn't know what to do with him. So he'd loaded what was left of his life into the bed of an old truck and driven until the roads got small and the sky got big, stopping only when the granite woods rose up in front of him like an answer he hadn't known he was asking for. The only creature who shared that cabin on Cold Creek Ridge was Ash. Ash had come to him as a half-grown husky, with paws too big for his legs and a coat the color of storm clouds over snow, silver-white along his flanks and tail, darker gray along his back and face, with a faint charcoal mask around eyes the bright amber of late afternoon light through whiskey. Now, at 6 years old, he was fully into his strength, chest broad, legs sure-footed, the thick double coat throwing off rain and snow with the arrogance only northern dogs possessed. Ash was quieter than most huskies Eli had met. He didn't yodel every opinion to the sky, saving his voice for when it mattered, a low whine when he sensed Eli drifting too far into his own head, a sharp bark when a stranger's truck crawled up the access road, a rising howl on the rare nights when the aurora spilled faint green ribbons over the ridge and the world felt thin and strange. There was mischief in him, sure. He'd steal socks from under Eli's nose and bury them in the snowbank, and more than one rabbit had learned that the slow, lazy trot was just an act. But beneath it all was a loyalty that felt almost human. In storms, Ash slept braced against Eli's legs like a living anchor. On hikes, he checked back every few minutes, yellow eyes measuring distance, as if he'd taken some silent oath to keep this one human upright and moving. Morning, on the day it began, came wrapped in fog, a thick, milky kind that slipped between the spruce trunks and swallowed the lower slopes, leaving only the tips of the pines and the jagged teeth of distant peaks floating above it like islands in a white sea. Eli woke before the weak sun cleared the eastern ridge, the way he always did, to the hiss of the wood stove and the whisper of wind fingering the chinks in the cabin walls. He shrugged into his jacket, poured black coffee into a metal mug, and stepped out onto the rough porch. The air bit at any exposed skin, the kind of sharp cold that promised snow before the week was out. But it was clean and honest, and it filled his lungs without argument. Ash padded out beside him, stretching until his spine popped, the fur along his back lifting in a ripple before settling again. For a moment, man and dog simply stood there, watching the world hold its breath. Down in the ravine, Cold Creek murmured under a skin of early ice. Somewhere higher up, a lone elk bugled once, thin and far away. Eli took a slow sip of coffee and felt the familiar mixture of ache and peace slide through him. Up here, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of things you only heard if you'd given up on filling it with your own noise. The plan for the day was the same as most days in this shoulder season between the last fire risk and the first true snow. Walk the southern loop, check the old snags for fresh bear sign, make sure the small cache of supplies he kept in a stump near the turnaround point was still dry and undisturbed. Routine had become a kind of quiet religion for him. Coffee, trail, work, fire, sleep. He finished his mug, set it on the railing, and whistled softly. Ash's ears snapped forward. "Come on, boy," Eli said, voice low and rough from disuse. "Let's see what the mountain's doing today." They set out along the narrow trail that slipped between spruce and lodgepole, Ash ranging ahead but never out of sight, the bell on his collar giving a dull, reassuring jingle each time he hopped over deadfall or shouldered through brush. The fog swallowed them within 50 yards of the cabin, softening the world at the edges, muffling even the sound of their own footsteps on the needle-carpeted ground. Eli knew these paths the way a man knows the lines in his own palm. He had cut some of them himself those first hard months, the work giving his hands something to do while his heart tried to decide whether to keep beating. He could have walked that loop blindfolded, could have hit every turn and switchback purely by memory. But that morning the forest felt different. He couldn't have said how at first. Maybe it was the way the fog moved, not in one direction, but curling slowly around trunks and boulders as if it had changed its mind about where it wanted to go. Maybe it was the faint scent under the usual mix of earth and sap, a trace of damp stone that didn't belong on this section of ridge. Or maybe it was nothing more than the quiet, insistent tug in his chest, like that first rope line you clip into before stepping out of a plane. Ash felt it before Eli put words to it. One moment the husky was trotting the familiar route, breath steaming, tongue lolling slightly. The next he stopped dead, head lifted, nose working the fog. A low sound rumbled in his throat. Not fear, not exactly, more like intense curiosity sharpened with caution. Then he looked back at Eli, eyes bright and focused, and without waiting for a command, turned hard to the left, off the beaten path. "Hey," Eli said softly, half a protest, half an old habit. Ash paused just long enough to huff once, as if answering, then slipped between two cedar trunks where no trail existed. For a moment Eli stood there, caught between the comfort of his loop and the unknown in the trees. He'd spent years avoiding surprises, building a life that did not allow for sudden left turns. But Ash had never steered him wrong, and something about the dog's body language, ears forward, tail level, muscles coiled but not tense, told him this wasn't a random chase after some squirrel. With a resigned exhale that turned to steam in the cold air, Eli stepped off the familiar path and followed. The ground sloped downward more steeply than he expected. Moss slicked the rocks underfoot, and unseen roots curled like sleeping snakes just beneath the duff, ready to catch a careless boot. Fog thickened in the hollows, thinning only where pale shafts of light pushed through gaps in the canopy. Eli used his gloved hand on trunks and branches to steady himself, the other tightening on the strap of the old canvas pack at his shoulder. Ahead, Ash moved with the sure-footed grace of something built for this country, weaving through ferns and wind-fallen limbs, stopping now and then to glance back, making sure the slow human shadow was still with him. They had gone farther off the loop than Eli liked before the land finally leveled out into a small, hidden basin he did not recognize. It felt like stepping into the center of a held breath. The trees opened just enough to reveal a low outcropping of rock on the far side, thick with moss and strung with old roots that reached down like gnarled fingers. At first glance it looked like any other boulder tumbled down from the ridge ages ago, half swallowed by time and weather. Then the light shifted, and Eli saw the darkness behind the curtain of green, the suggestion of an opening where no opening should have been. Ash walked straight toward it and stopped, claws clicking on the damp stone near the threshold. He stood very still, tail lowered but not tucked, ears sharp, gaze fixed into that blackness as if he could see something moving there just beyond the line where the weak daylight failed. A small chill crept up Eli's spine, subtle but undeniable. He had roamed these woods for 5 years, up and down every draw and spur he'd thought worth his boots, and he had never once seen this place. Caves weren't unheard of in the granite woods, but a man usually heard about them. Hunters traded that kind of knowledge over coffee and pie in town. This one had kept its secret. He stepped closer, feeling the temperature drop with each pace, the air from the opening carrying the mineral tang of cold stone and something else he couldn't quite name, like an old story breathed out after being held too long, laid a palm against the rock beside the entrance. The moss was damp and cool, slick against his calluses. Above him, roots from the trees clung to the stone, twisting down around the mouth of the cave as if trying to pull it shut. For reasons he couldn't have explained, the whole formation struck him less as geology and more as something intentional. The mountains didn't often reveal new things to a man who thought he knew them, not without a reason. Ash glanced back at him, amber eyes reflecting a faint, uncanny glimmer from the dark beyond, then returned his attention to the void ahead. In that quiet hollow, wrapped in fog and shadow, Eli Boone felt something he hadn't in a very long time. Not the old spike of panic that came with memories of fire, not the dull ache of loss that had followed him up every trail for years, but a different kind of pull. A sense that he was standing on the edge of a moment that might bend the rest of his life. For the first time since he'd fled into these wilds, the mountain wasn't just a refuge he hid inside. It felt like it was turning toward him, calling him inward, not to escape the world below, but toward something waiting in the dark, something that had been there long before he arrived and that, somehow, had been waiting specifically for him. The opening of the cave waited before Eli like something ancient that had crawled up from the bedrock, a stone maw framed by roots that hung in crooked strands, some thick as rope and others thin as brittle wire, all of them swaying subtly as if stirred by a draft from deep within. The moss that coated the stone breathed out a faint, earthy scent that mixed with the cooler mineral air rolling from the darkness, and for a moment Eli simply stood there, with Ash pressed close to his leg, both man and dog silent as they weighed the strangeness of a place they should have passed 100 times and somehow never seen. He crouched and brushed his hand over the threshold, feeling the grit and chill of untouched stone, then eased himself inside, careful to keep Ash behind him, though the husky kept pushing forward with a low, uneasy whine. The cave widened just a few steps in, the ceiling rising enough that he could stand upright, and the fog outside dimmed to a bluish glow that barely lit the chamber. It was the walls that caught his breath, the crude shapes carved into them, some painted in smeared charcoal, others scratched directly into the stone. Mountain silhouettes with jagged peaks, a long trestle bridge spanning a river that twisted like a vein, a strange, narrow cabin perched on stilts above water. These weren't random scrawls, they were landmarks, places that looked so particular that someone had taken the time to remember them with sharp intention. Eli lifted his lantern and stepped closer, the flame throwing a warm pulse against lines that seemed to shift and deepen under the flickering light. Something in the arrangement of the drawings, it wasn't artistry, but a kind of message, made him think of Marianne, though he couldn't explain why until his gaze fell on what lay just to the right of the cabin drawing. The carving was small, almost an afterthought. 2 angled lines cut cleanly into the stone. A double chevron. Eli felt the air leave his lungs in a single sharp breath, his pulse skittering in a way it hadn't in years. He reached out and traced the symbol with his fingers, feeling the grooves exactly where they always were when he and Marianne had scratched them into pine trunks along trails in the Bitterroot Range, back when their weekends were spent chasing ridge lines and promising each other that no matter how far they wandered, they'd always leave a sign so the other could find the way home. A promise that had become unbearable after the river ice cracked beneath her 4 winters ago, taking her from him in a silence that still made him stop breathing sometimes without noticing. But Marianne had never stepped foot in the granite woods. They had never hiked this ridge. She had never even seen this valley except in photographs he brought back. And yet the mark was here, carved not with the hesitant hand of a stranger trying to imitate a symbol, but with the same confident dip at the start of each line that Marianne used when she worked with a pocket knife on soft bark. "No," Eli muttered under his breath, his voice rough, not denying the mark itself but refusing to entertain the implication. Ash pressed his nose to the dirt and let out another soft whine, pawing at a patch of leaves near the cave's rear corner. Eli turned, stooped, and brushed them aside. Something metal glinted beneath the soil, half buried as if it had been here for years. He pulled it free. A tin whistle, dented, old, the sort used by rail workers decades ago to signal shifts and danger on the North Wind spur line, long before the tracks rusted and the forest claimed them. The cold metal sent a faint chill through his glove as he turned it over, and in the lantern glow he saw the inscription scratched onto the underside in thin, hesitant lines. "Help me find the light." The words weren't carved with confidence. They looked scratched by someone whose hands trembled or who had written in the dark. He held it for a long moment, Ash's breath warm against his wrist, before he looked back at the drawings and the double Chevy and felt a pressure gather low in his chest, slow and heavy as a settling snowfall. There was something wrong here, deeply wrong, but not in the way of danger. It was wrong like a memory coming back in pieces that don't fit the present. Eli stepped farther into the cave, following the wall with his hand, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The carvings continued deeper than he expected, some more detailed, some rushed, as though the artist had returned many times, sometimes patient, sometimes desperate. He knelt at one point to examine a set of scratch marks that looked less like drawings and more like tallies, small vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, a long chain of them that curved with the wall. Someone had counted days here, weeks, maybe months. The thought made the back of Eli's neck prickle. The granite woods were unforgiving. Anyone staying in a cave like this for more than a night would need supplies, warmth, shelter. Yet there were no signs of bedding or fire pits, no trash, no remnants of food. Just the drawings and the strange, quiet sense that the air had been thick with someone's breath not too long ago. Ash's ears flicked backward, and he let out a single low rumble that vibrated through his chest. Eli heard it too, a faint shift of air from deeper in the cave. Not movement exactly, but a change in pressure, like the way wind pushes through canyon cracks on still days. He raised the lantern higher, the flame trembling. Nothing moved, and yet the space felt aware of him, as though it had been waiting for a pair of human footsteps to echo inside it again. He stood very still, letting the cold seep into the edges of his jacket, listening to the dripping of water somewhere beyond the lantern's reach. The truths of the mountain came slowly, in their own time, but this one felt like it had been waiting for years, patient and unmoving. Eli closed his fist around the whistle, feeling the faint grooves of the inscription bite into his palm, and for the first time since Marianne fell through the ice, he felt something other than grief gnawing at him. Something like gravity drawing him deeper, not physically, but inward, toward a place he had not dared to enter for a long time. He did not understand what the cave wanted from him, or why the symbol from another life lay carved on its walls, but he knew one thing without question. Whatever truth lived in this stone chamber had not come here by accident, and it had not been left for just anyone. It had waited for him. And now that he'd found it, his life on the ridge would never be the same again. By the time dawn broke through the thinning fog, Eli had barely slept, though he had kept the lantern burning on the cabin table until the flame guttered low. The tin whistle lay between his palms for most of the night, its cold weight refusing to let his thoughts drift anywhere but back to the drawings carved on the cave walls, the double confirm, and the message etched in trembling letters no one should have known to leave for him. When the sky finally shifted to pale gold across Cold Creek Ridge, he rose without ceremony, packed only what he needed, water, jerky, rope, and the whistle tucked deep in his jacket pocket, and stepped out into the crisp morning alongside Ash, whose ears were already pricked toward the forest with a sense of direction that felt less like instinct and more like purpose. The cave's map had been crude, yet one sketch stood out among the scattered symbols. A jagged line with small crosshatches, unmistakably the layout of a railroad spur long abandoned to snow and years. The North Wind Spur. A rugged branch once laid across the mountain in the early 70s for timber runs had been shut down after a series of accidents that locals still whispered about over coffee in Wildford's diner. They said the rail crews had worked through storms, dynamited frozen shale, and lost good men to rock slides and equipment failures so brutal the company quietly paid families to keep questions out of newspapers. No one maintained the trail now. The forest reclaimed it, inch by inch. But if someone had etched it into a hidden cave wall, someone had been there, tracking it, marking it, maybe trying to escape something they couldn't outrun. Eli and Ash moved steadily through the pines until the land opened into a narrow cut between ridges where rusted rails jutted from mounds of earth like broken ribs. Snowmelt pooled along the ties, and blackberry vines twisted through the sleepers. As they followed the twisted line, Eli imagined the old locomotives chugging through this pass, headlights cutting the dark, men clinging to rail cars with lanterns, unaware that decades later this place would be remembered not in engineering reports, but in whispers about ghosts and unfinished stories. Ash trotted ahead, occasionally stopping to scent the air, tail held level, as if something familiar, something from the cave, lingered here. They passed bent rail spikes, a collapsed tool shed half sunk into mud, and a tangle of old cables still anchored to cracked stone. Then, as they rounded a bend where the track curved over a ravine, Ash suddenly stiffened and broke into a sprint toward the far end of a fallen trestle bridge. The collapse looked old, but not ancient. Planks splintered outward, a few beams still angled across the gap like the bones of a long-dead giant. At first, Eli didn't see what had caught the dog's attention. Then he noticed the patch of dark moss clinging to an object wedged beneath a fractured timber near the far bank. Ash whined sharply, pawing at the beam until Eli crossed carefully, testing each step, crouching beside the dog to pry the object free. What he lifted into daylight was a canvas satchel, stiff from cold and moisture, but intact enough to hold shape. The old buckles were tarnished, the stitching frayed, but something about its weight suggested it had carried more than tools or lunch in its time. He slid to a sitting position on a flat stone, Ash planting himself protectively at his side, and opened the satchel. Inside lay 3 items that didn't belong to the same decade, let alone the same life. The first was a photograph. A young woman in her 20s, dark hair tied back in a simple band, serious eyes, strong cheekbones, and a faint smile that looked earned rather than given. She wore a surveyor's jacket, the old canvas kind issued by rail companies, its collar turned up against wind he could almost feel through the image. Eli didn't know her, but the picture held the unmistakable gravity of someone who had lived more alone than most. Next was a compact journal wrapped in deer hide, the cover soft with age and darkened at the edges as if it had been handled often during cold nights. Eli untied the leather strap and flipped open to the first page. The handwriting struck him at once, not the shape of Marianne's looping lyrical script, but something that stirred a different recognition he couldn't place. These letters were narrow, slightly slanted, curved at the edges, written by someone who took their time to measure thoughts before setting them down. He read a few scattered entries, notes about scouting terrain, concerns about unstable rock, short remarks about weather closing in faster than the team could work. Then, threaded between the technical lines were personal observations from a woman drifting gradually into fear. She wrote of odd shadows moving between trees even on windless days, of hearing footsteps behind her when she knew she'd walked alone. of an unshakable feeling that the mountains were watching, not malevolently, but with a kind of patience that felt too aware. Her name appeared near the top of an entry dated late autumn. Lorna Vale. Eli looked again at the photograph, the sharp eyes, the squared shoulders, and imagined a woman whose life had spanned long days in rugged terrain, one accustomed to solitude, but not untouched by it. The journal's later pages grew more frantic, not sloppy, but pressed harder, the ink darker, as though whatever she feared had stepped closer. One line mentioned the shadow in the woods, underlined once. Another noted that her crew had dismissed her warnings as nerves from overwork. Her final entry shook Eli more than the symbol carved in the cave. The words were short, written with a trembling urgency. If someone finds this, follow the Lightfall Trail. I'm not alone out here, and neither are you. Beneath it, the ink blotched slightly, as if the pen had hovered mid-thought. Eli closed the journal slowly, his thumb brushing the deer hide, mind racing with questions that felt uncomfortably close to answers he wasn't ready to accept. The third object in the satchel was a folded map, the paper yellowed, corners softened. Across the top, in crisp block letters, was stamped Pine Rail Project, 1972. The map detailed the entire Northwind Spur and its branching survey trails, including one labeled Lightfall, weaving deep into a section of forest Eli knew to be unnaturally dense and almost pathless. Locals rarely went near it, not because of superstition, but because compasses misbehaved in those woods and radios cut out without explanation. Eli exhaled a slow, heavy breath as he studied the trail's arc. The mountain felt tighter around him, as if the ridges themselves leaned closer, listening. None of this felt random. Someone had left these items exactly where he, and not another hiker or ranger, would find them. And if the cave's symbol had been a shock, this was something deeper. A converging thread pulling him toward a story that didn't belong only to the past. He lifted his gaze to the tree line where Ash stood alert, amber eyes fixed on the forest ahead with an intensity that made Eli's pulse thrum. The mountains weren't just keeping secrets. They were choosing the moment to show them. And it seemed they had chosen him, a man who knew loss, who knew silence, and who had nothing left to fear except the truth he'd tried so long to bury.
Lightfall Trail revealed itself the way old stories do, reluctantly, like it needed to decide whether a man was worthy the rest. It wasn't a true path so much as the ghost of one, winding through fir groves where snow still clung stubbornly to shaded roots, and the air hung with a stillness that swallowed every footstep Eli and Ash made. The trail markers carved by Lorna Vale decades earlier were faint, nearly reclaimed by time and bark, but Ash navigated them as if he could scent the memory of the hands that made them. The mountain had grown quiet, too quiet, as if everything from deer to wind held its breath. By late afternoon, the sky bled into copper, and the ridgeline sharpened into silhouettes against the dying light. That was when Eli saw it. A fire lookout cabin perched high on stilts above the valley, its wooden supports angled like spindly legs trying to hold on against years of storms. The structure leaned just slightly, but not enough to suggest abandonment. Smoke didn't rise from the chimney, yet something about the place hummed with presence, like a held note on a string instrument. Ash froze before they'd even crossed the clearing. The Husky's hackles lifted, tail rigid, muscles coiled with a tension not rooted in fear but in some deeper instinct that Eli had learned to trust more than any compass. "Easy," Eli murmured, laying a hand on the dog's neck.
Ash didn't ease, not fully, but he didn't pull away either. They approached with care. The cabin's stairs creaked as Eli tested a boot on the first step, and the sound snapped across the valley like brittle glass. Eli waited, listening. The wind carried nothing, no breath, no shuffle, no closing door. But Ash kept glancing toward the windows, the corners of the porch, the dark sliver beneath the stilts, as if expecting something or someone to step forward. Eli climbed the stairs slowly. Ash padded behind him, pause, silent. The door was shut, but not latched. A push of Eli's hand swung it open, letting out a faint exhale of warm, stale air that brushed his face like the room itself had been waiting for him. Inside, the cabin held shadows shaped by old beams and the last traces of sunset leaking through warped glass. It wasn't abandoned. Not even close. A lantern sat on the small table near the window, its brass still warm when Eli touched it. Beside it rested a cup of tea, steam long gone, but liquid still faintly amber, not yet congealed by the cold. A wool blanket hung over the back of a chair, thick, navy-colored, woven in a pattern Eli recognized as the kind sold only at Reed's trading post down in Wildford. Someone had been here very recently, maybe minutes, maybe seconds. On the table, centered with a kind of reverence, sat a hand-carved wooden box. The lid was polished smooth, corners rounded, edges worn from years, maybe decades of being handled. But what stopped Eli cold was his name etched into the top. Elliard Boone, carved in a script no stranger should know. "No," Eli whispered under his breath, though he wasn't sure what he was denying, the impossibility of it, the familiarity, or the feeling that the mountains were folding his past back into his present with deliberate hands. Ash pressed against his leg, whining, not out of fear but something closer to recognition, a strange alertness that made the hairs on Eli's arms rise. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded note on parchment, the ink dark and steady, the handwriting poised and confident. "You're closer than you think, Elliard Boone. Don't stop now." No signature, no hint of identity, just the unmistakable certainty that whoever had written it knew not just his name, but his path, his hesitation, the weight he carried. And beneath the note, Eli's breath left him in a slow, stunned exhale. A ring. Mary Ann's ring. Not just any ring, but the one she had worn every day. The one engraved on the inside with a small evergreen tree flanked by 2 chevrons, their shared mark for "Find your way home." The same ring that had slipped from her frozen fingers the day the river ice gave way. He had searched the banks until nightfall, until dawn, until search crews made him stop. They never found it. Yet here it was, resting in the box like it had merely traveled ahead of him and waited patiently to be retrieved. Eli curled his fingers around it. It felt warm, impossibly warm, like it had been held moments earlier by a living hand. Something inside him broke open, raw and stunned, memories rising in a surge he wasn't ready for. Mary Ann's laughter echoing across snowfields, her fingers cold and intertwined with his, the fragrant pine smoke smell that followed her everywhere. He staggered slightly, bracing himself against the table. "How?" he whispered, but the question dissolved into the quiet. Ash nudged him, muzzle pressing firmly against his thigh, then took a step toward the door, tail low, posture tense. The dog wasn't afraid. Eli knew that posture too well. This was recognition. As if Ash scented someone he remembered, someone who had once stood close enough to him to leave an imprint deeper than time. Eli swallowed hard, heart hammering. The only other soul Ash had ever reacted to this way was Mary Ann. But she was gone. Gone in a way no one walked back from. Yet the ring lay warm in his palm. The lantern had been left burning, the tea unfinished. Someone connected to her, someone who knew their past intimately, had been here. Eli turned toward the darkening trail outside. The cabin creaked around him, as if settling after holding its breath. Ash let out a low, deliberate sound, not a growl, not a bark, something like a whisper made from instinct. Whoever had been here wasn't running from him. They were leading him. And they were close. The dawn broke with a thin blade of gold cutting across the ridge, the kind of fragile morning light that made the frost glitter like scattered glass along the creek bed below the cabin. Eli had slept little. The ring still lay on the table beside him, catching what little moonlight had seeped through the window through the night, as though refusing to dim. Ash had stayed alert, pacing slowly between the door and Eli's chair, ears twitching with each shift in the wind. When the first hints of morning arrived, Eli heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps in the snow, slow, measured, not panicked or hurried. He stepped outside before instinct could warn him otherwise, and the cold ripped across his face, sharp enough to make him inhale short. Down by the frozen creek stood a woman. She didn't belong to any of the stories he knew, yet looked like she had stepped out of one. Early 30s, tall but delicate in frame, wearing a weathered canvas coat that hung unevenly from the shoulders, its seams stitched and restitched until the repairs themselves had become part of the garment's identity. Her hair, long and dark as wet river stone, fluttered with the lightest breeze, though the air around her seemed disturbingly still. Something about her presence felt both undeniably there and yet fragile, as though fog had molded itself into human shape and the sunlight struggled to decide whether to illuminate her or let her fade. Ash halted at the porch, tail stiff, posture conflicted between curiosity and wariness, a soft whine slipping from his throat. Eli approached slowly, boots crunching the frost. The woman didn't flinch, didn't step back. She simply lifted her gaze and met his eyes with a calmness that shook him more than fear ever could. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting, not minutes or days, but years measured differently, in ways Eli didn't yet understand. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, clear, but carried something hollow beneath it, like an echo from far inside the earth. "My name is Lorna Vale." Eli felt the world tilt the way it had the day he lost the ring, the day the cave showed him the symbol he never expected to see again. He knew that name, had read it in ink decades old, had held her journal, had seen her photograph unchanged by time. But the woman before him did not look ravaged by decades. She looked nearly the same as the photo in the satchel, sharp eyes, steady posture, as if time had only brushed past her rather than traveling through her. "Lorna Vale is gone," Eli said, his own voice a strained whisper. "You should be..." "Older?" she finished gently, a faint sadness in her smile. "Yes, and I would be, if the mountain had not kept me." She lifted her gaze to the ridge as though the land itself were listening. "The mountains kept me alive, Eliard Boone, and now they've brought you." Something inside Eli faltered, not from fear, but recognition, as if some invisible, the thread between the cave, the satchel, the ring, and this woman had tightened all at once. "How?" he asked, breath shaky in the cold. Lorna stepped closer, the frost beneath her boots barely shifting, as though the ground itself cushioned her weight. "The mountain doesn't bend time," she said, "but it protects those who listen. I found something years ago, something that shouldn't exist, a place where the river light bends." Her eyes gleamed faintly like moonlit water. where moments stay alive if they're loved enough. Eli felt Ash press against his leg, trembling. Not a fear tremble, something deeper, animal, instinctive, like he recognized her scent woven somewhere faintly into a forgotten memory. Lorna reached into her coat pocket and drew out something small, nestled in her palm. Eli's breath vanished. Marianne's ring, gleaming with a warmth that defied the morning cold. Lorna held it out to him with both hands, as though passing something sacred. "I found this in the Riverlight Hollow," she said. "It was caught in the light bend. Your love kept it from sinking into the water." Eli closed his fingers around the ring again, pulse thrumming, the familiar metal dangerously warm, as if it remembered Marianne's touch more clearly than his own. "Riverlight Hollow?" he asked hoarsely. "Where is it?" Lorna didn't answer immediately. She turned her head, listening to something Eli couldn't hear. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its softness. "The hollow is weakening," she murmured. "Something is trapped there. Something calling for you." A gust of wind brushed past, but it wasn't ordinary wind. It carried a faint, trembling sound, like a woman's voice underwater. Ash let out a sharp cry, backing up a step, tail tucked as he stared toward the valley with wide, fearful eyes. Eli felt something inside him fracture, a painful, aching recognition that made his knees weaken. He knew that voice. Even buried in wind and distance, even softened beyond nature, he knew it. Marianne. The sound lingered for a few seconds, then faded into the rustle of the trees. Eli turned to Lorna, throat tight, but she was already stepping back toward the trees, her outline blending with the dim morning light, as though the world wasn't sure whether to keep her visible. Her face held a quiet urgency, not fear, but a plea. "You don't have much time," she said softly. "If you want to reach her, you must follow the hollow's call before the light closes." Eli's heart beat hard enough to hurt. "Is she alive?" he rasped. Lorna's expression trembled, not with uncertainty, but with the weight of truth she couldn't speak plainly. "The hollow keeps what the world loses," she whispered. "But nothing stays untouched forever." And then she stepped back into a thin veil of fog that rose from the creek and vanished, as if swallowed by the morning. Ash whimpered, and Eli instinctively dropped a hand to the dog's fur, steadying both of them against the impossible. But impossible no longer mattered. The ring was warm. The voice had called. And Lorna Vale, dead to the world for 50 years, had stood in front of him. Marianne was reaching for him from a place the mountain had hidden, and Eli knew with a clarity that rooted itself into bone, whatever waited inside Riverlight Hollow was meant for him. The world seemed thinner as Eli followed Lorna into the ravines, the morning light struggling to penetrate the pale mist that drifted like breath through the trees. Ash stayed close at his heel, every instinct in the dog registering an unease that Eli felt in the marrow of his bones. The land had shifted. He couldn't say exactly where or when, but somewhere between the cabin and the winding descent, the granite woods had crossed a threshold into something older and deeper than any valley he'd walked before. Lorna moved ahead with a certainty that appeared neither hurried nor hesitant. She moved as someone who had traveled this path alone for countless years and learned each contour by memory, though her steps barely disturbed the frost beneath her boots. Eli wondered if she was half spirit herself, tethered to the mountain only by the weight of unfinished stories. The mist clung to them like thin fabric, cooling the skin and dulling sound until even their breathing felt softer. Birds did not call. Branches did not snap. Even the wind seemed unwilling to trespass. They descended through a narrow split between two cliffs, the stone walls rising so steeply that they blotted out most of the sky. When the ravine widened, the ground beneath them glimmered faintly. At first, Eli thought it was frost catching the dim light, but then he saw the moss, bioluminescent, glowing in pulses, breathing in soft waves of pale blue and green. The walls of the ravine shimmered with it, a living heartbeat spreading across the stone. It felt like walking inside the rib cage of the mountain. Lorna paused, her dark hair drifting behind her like smoke. "The hollow keeps memories," she said quietly, the light reflecting in her eyes. "But it also keeps the lost." Her words reached Eli in a way nothing else had since the day Marianne vanished beneath the ice. They walked on, guided by the faint hum that rose from the moss, a sound too low to name but deep enough that Eli felt it vibrating in his chest. The ravine opened into a wider chamber, sheltered by high stone and coiled roots. At its center lay a pool of water, so dark it swallowed reflection, so still it appeared carved from obsidian. It seemed wrong, somehow, to disturb something that looked as if time itself had frozen around it. Lorna stopped several steps back, folding her hands behind her. "This is the place where the river light bends," she murmured, her voice almost reverent. "Where what was loved does not fall away as quickly as the world demands." Eli stepped closer, Ash glued to his side, trembling but refusing to leave. The surface of the water shifted when he knelt, just barely, like it recognized him. The reflection blurred, then cleared, and a face rose from the depths. Marianne, not altered by years, not changed by death, exactly as she had been the last day he held her hand. Hair wind-tangled, eyes bright enough to warm winter, mouth balanced between laughter and something thoughtful that always made him want to draw her closer. Eli's breath crumpled in his chest. "Mari." The water shimmered at the sound of her name, light rippling like a slow exhale. Her voice rose from beneath the surface, not muffled, not warped by water, but distant, as if traveling across an impossible span. "Eli," she whispered, the syllable trembling with a familiarity that cracked him open. "You have to let go, or you'll drown here too." His hands shook violently. Tears slipped down his face, unbidden, falling into the pool. When each drop landed, it brightened, glowing faintly, pulsing like a dying ember. "I never got to say goodbye," he choked. "I never." The reflection leaned closer, her features softening. "You did," her voice answered gently. "But you were the one who couldn't hear it." Eli felt the old ache inside him twist, raw and tender, like a bone finally set after years of being out of place. Marianne's face flickered faintly, not vanishing, but becoming lighter. Ash pushed his head under Eli's shaking hand, grounding him, reminding him that he was still tethered to something alive, something loyal. The water brightened, then dimmed. Not violently, not like extinguishing a flame, but like releasing a soul with gentleness rather than grief. When the last shimmer faded, only the dark pool remained. Lorna stepped forward, but kept her distance, her face solemn, almost mournful. "You weren't called here to bring her back, Eli." Her voice was quieter than the silence. "You were called so you could finally go forward." The words rooted themselves into the space Marianne's fading light had left behind.
The storm arrived long before the sky had a chance to warn them, rolling over Cold Creek Ridge like a living thing, its first growl echoing through the trees as the last remnant of Riverlight Hollow dimmed behind them. Eli felt the wind shift violently, pulling at his jacket, whipping through Ash's fur with a fierceness that made the dog flatten his ears. Snow came next, not gentle flakes, but sharp pellets carried sideways, stinging the skin and blurring the world into streaks of white and shadow. Lightning carved jagged scars across the sky, illuminating the ravine walls that had once held their soft, bioluminescent glow. Now, the moss flickered erratically, sputtering like dying embers. Lorna stood at the hollow's edge, the strange light from the pool casting faint outlines along her face. But even those outlines trembled, as if the world struggled to keep her present. Eli stepped beside her, gripping Ash's collar to steady the dog as thunder boomed overhead. "What's happening?" His voice barely cut through the wind. Lorna didn't turn at first. Her gaze stayed pinned on the collapsing glow, a soft pulse shrinking with every second, as if the hollow were inhaling its final breath. When she did face him, her expression was tighter, the calmness she always carried stretched thin. "When a heart that's been grieving too long finally softens," she said, raising her voice slightly against the storm, "the mountain shifts." The storm crackled around them, but her words were steady. "Your letting go is opening something. For me, too." Eli blinked through the snow, confused, muscles tensing. "For you?" Lorna drew in a long, shaking breath, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain, not fragile, but human. "I wasn't meant to remain here," she murmured. "Not like this." She lifted a hand to her chest as if feeling something beneath the surface, something loosening. "I wasn't ageless, Eliard Boone, not protected, not chosen." The storm surged, sending a cascade of icy flakes sideways across her coat, yet she didn't flinch. "I was caught." Eli felt the words hit him harder than the wind. "Caught?" Her eyes glimmered, bright, mournful. "I found the hollow decades ago, by accident. I went where the riverlight bends, where memories refuse to fade. I didn't understand what it meant." The moss behind her flickered violently. She continued, voice cracking for the first time. "And I was suspended, between moments, between years, between breaths. I couldn't leave until another grieving soul arrived, someone whose pain was strong enough, deep enough to stir the hollow's balance." Eli swallowed hard. Understanding crept through him like thawed ice breaking free. "Me," he whispered. "It needed me." "Yes," Lorna said softly. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. "You freed me when you faced your past." Behind them, Hollow shuddered, its glow narrowing into thin, trembling lines of light that danced across the black water before sinking beneath the surface. The ravine groaned, a low rumble like the earth protesting its own unraveling. "But dawn will decide," Lorna said, stepping back as a tremor rippled through the ground. "Whether I live outside the hollow or fade with it." Her voice held no fear, only a tired resignation Eli recognized all too well, because it was the same tone he had once spoken with during the first empty winter after Mary Ann's death. Something inside him, something long frozen, shifted. Care, fear, hope. A mixture he hadn't felt in years. Lorna stumbled as the ground lurched. Eli caught her arm without thinking. Her skin was cold, not the chill of winter, but the chill of something barely tethered to the world. "You're not fading," he said, gripping her hand with a steadiness that surprised even him. "Not on my watch." She looked up, startled by the conviction in his voice.
Something warm flickered in her expression, not the eerie light of the hollow, but something human and painfully alive. Ash barked loudly, pulling their attention to the ridge above them. The storm had grown feral. Branches snapped in the wind, trees bent dangerously. The faint path they'd taken down into the hollow was already half buried in snow and debris. They had minutes, maybe less, before the ravine became impassable. Eli squeezed Lorna's hand once more. "We need to move." She nodded, breath visible in short bursts. With Ash leading, they pushed against the wind, climbing the slick terrain. The snow roared around them like a river turned to ice, each gust threatening to knock them from their feet. Eli shielded Lorna as best he could, guiding her across unstable patches where the ground had begun shifting under the hollow's collapse. Behind them, the soft light of the moss sputtered out entirely, swallowed by darkness. A deep, resounding crack split the air, stone giving way as if the earth itself were closing the door on the hollow forever. Lorna glanced back once, face pale with both loss and relief. Eli didn't let her linger. "Come on!" he shouted. Together they climbed faster, slipping, catching each other, stumbling through snow so thick it felt like wading through smoke. By the time they reached the upper ledge, the storm had become a white wall, the wind screaming across Cold Creek Ridge. Eli saw only glimpses of the forest, dark trunks, flashes of broken branches, swirling shadows, but he knew the direction by instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through fire seasons and long winters. "To the lookout cabin!" he yelled, pointing through the chaos. Ash barked sharply in agreement and launched forward, carving a path with sheer determination. The hollow groaned again behind them, then fell silent, its strange light dimming into the earth like an extinguished star. Lorna clung to Eli's arm as the last pulse of unnatural glow sank beneath the stone, leaving only the storm to fill the night. And together, Eli, Lorna, and Ash, they pushed into the blizzard, racing toward the only shelter left on the ridge as the hollow collapsed behind them. The storm that had torn the hollow open through the night vanished by morning, as if it had never existed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and sharp beneath a sheet of frost that glittered like hammered silver across the slopes. Cold Creek Ridge, normally rugged and shadowed before dawn, looked newborn under the first pale rays that crept over the horizon. Smoke from Eli's small fire curled into the still air in a thin ribbon, rising straight upward as though even the wind had paused to watch what came next. Lorna stood near the ridge's edge, wrapped in one of Eli's thick wool blankets, though she held it loosely, not for warmth, but as if relearning the sensation of fabric against living skin. Her breath plumed in soft clouds as she drew the cold air deep into her lungs, eyes closed, lips parted in wonder. It was a woman tasting life again after decades suspended not in death, but in something half forgotten. When she finally opened her eyes, the light struck them like a spark. "I'm still here," she whispered, touching a hand to her chest as though confirming her own solidity, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from awe. Eli watched from a short distance, leaning against a frost-dusted pine. For the first time in years, his chest didn't feel like a locked box filled with splinters. Something had loosened, quietly, steadily, as though the mountain itself had shifted to make room for a feeling he hadn't expected to carry again. Possibility. Ash trotted between them, shaking his thick coat so frost scattered like diamonds, then pressed his head against Lorna's leg with a confidence that said he had already decided she belonged here. Lorna smiled, a small, fragile curve of her lips that held more meaning than any attempt at words. Eli felt warmth settle in a place he thought would stay winter forever. They lingered only until the sun climbed enough to melt the thin crust of ice on the ridge. The land below stretched open in a quilt of white and evergreen, miles of untouched wilderness leading toward Wildford,
The town that had once gossiped about the smoke jumper who ran from everything. Now, Eli realized, it was the place where life waited. Loud, flawed, human. He packed what little they needed while Lorna folded the blanket carefully, as though the simple act of preparing to descend the mountain was sacred. When they began the trek down, the snow crunched beneath their boots, and Ash loped ahead, tail high, occasionally circling back as if ensuring neither of them drifted too far into the weight of their own thoughts. Lorna walked slowly at first, studying everything. The bark on trees, the thin ice on branches, the scattered hoofprints of elk, with curiosity so earnest it tugged at Eli's chest. This was a woman returning to a world she hadn't felt beneath her feet for half a century. When she paused, resting a hand over her heart, Eli stepped beside her. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though eyes glistened with something deeper than simple emotion. "The mountain didn't save me," she said, voice steady but carried on a fragile breath. "You did." Eli shook his head, instinctive, immediate. "No," he murmured, meeting her gaze fully. "We saved each other." The truth of it hung between them, warm as sunlight despite the cold. Lorna reached out, not timidly, not boldly, but with the care of someone who understood the fragility of second chances, and brushed her fingers along Eli's hand. He didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just curled his fingers around hers, quietly, as if this small gesture could root them both into the present better than any words. They continued down the trail side by side, footsteps slow but certain. Above them, the sky brightened into a clear churn of gold and pale blue, the kind of sky the mountains reserved for new beginnings. When they reached the lower ridge, Ash stiffened, ears pricking toward the rising sun. A moment later he barked, a single, sharp, joyful sound, and bounded forward through the frost, tail whipping with excitement. Sunlight broke clean across the ridge then, flooding the world with a brilliance that made the frost burst into 1,000 glittering shards. It wasn't magic, not the dangerous kind of Riverlight Hollow, but something gentler, a reminder that even the harshest landscapes could offer beauty when the night finally passed. Eli stopped to take it in. Lorna did too. The light gilded her features, warmed her breath, softened the decades of shadow clinging to her spirit. She looked alive in a way Eli hadn't seen, not in the hollow, not in the storm, not on the frozen creek, but here, under honest sunlight. A new day, a new beginning, a new love. Not something that erased the past, but something shaped by it, quiet and patient. The kind built between souls that had both known loss deeply enough to recognize the courage in hope. They stood there for a long moment, just breathing together, letting the morning claim them. Far behind them, deep within the granite woods, beyond the ravine, beyond the roots glowing faintly, beyond the stone where memories bent and time softened, the Riverlight Hollow pulsed one last time. A faint, fragile shimmer, like a heartbeat fading into peace, like a blessing whispered by the mountain itself. In the quiet weeks that followed, the mountains settled back into their long winter breath, and life on Cold Creek Ridge found a gentler rhythm. Eli learned the sound of Lorna's laughter echoing across the valley, learned how Ash would nudge her hand as if welcoming her into the small circle of beings he trusted. Some mornings, the three of them would stand at the ridge together, watching the first light spill over the trees, the world below stretching open like a promise waiting to be kept. Eli often wondered why the mountain had woven their lives together in such a strange way, why it had held memories so tightly and returned them in pieces when the time was right. But in the soft hours before sunrise, when the sky glowed faint pink and the frost clung to the needles of the pines, he felt the answer more than he understood it.
Some paths do not appear until a heart is finally ready to walk them. Some wounds do not heal until love, in one form or another, finds its way back through the dark. And sometimes, the grace of God does not come as thunder or fire, but as a quiet, guiding hand that leads us through the hollow places of our lives and back into the light, with gentleness we do not deserve, but somehow still receive. Eli carried that truth with him as the days grew longer. He knew now that loss does not mean the end of the story. Grief can carve deep hollows inside a person, but those hollows can hold light too, if we allow them. And the people we lose do not disappear entirely. They stay in the choices we make, in the kindness we offer, and in the courage it takes to start again when our hearts are tired. That was the gift Marianne had left him, and the gift Lorna had taught him how to hold. What this story reminds us is simple but hard to live. Healing does not come by pretending the past never happened. It comes by honoring what shaped us while still choosing to walk forward with hope. The mountains teach the same lesson every spring. No matter how long the winter feels, no matter how heavy the snow lies on the branches, the light always returns. And so can we. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share what part stayed with you. If you want to follow more stories like this one, feel free to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. And may the Lord watch over you and those you love, guiding your steps the way He guided Eli through the mountain paths. May His peace rest gently on your home tonight.